Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're embarking on an incredible journey back in time, to the very beginnings of a story that would shape a nation. This is Chapter 1, A Dream of Freedom. Imagine living in a world where your deepest beliefs, the very essence of how you connect with your faith, are dictated by the state. This was the reality for a small group of people in early 17th century England. We now call them the Pilgrims, but back then, they were known as separatists. Why? Because they wanted to separate from the official Church of England. Now, this wasn't a decision they took lightly. The Church of England, established by King Henry VIII, was the only legally recognized church. The reigning monarch, King James I, was not only the head of state, but also the head of the church. He famously declared, "No bishop, no king," meaning the church's structure and his royal authority were intertwined. He demanded absolute conformity. For him, religious dissent was not just a spiritual matter. It was an act of political defiance. So, what was the problem with the Church of England? For the separatists, it was too close to its Catholic roots. They were devout Protestants who believed that the church needed to be purified of all its ceremonies, elaborate rituals, and hierarchical structure. They felt the ornate robes, the use of incense, the kneeling for communion, all of it was a distraction from a simple, direct relationship with God, guided solely by the Bible. They wanted to return to what they saw as the simplicity of the early Christian church. They yearned for a community where they could choose their own ministers and worship according to their conscience, not according to a prayer book mandated by a king. This desire put them on a collision course with the authorities. Attending their own secret services was illegal. They faced constant harassment, fines, and even imprisonment. Neighbors spied on them. Their homes were watched. They were ostracized, unable to hold public office or send their children to universities. Life became a constant struggle, a shadow of fear hanging over every secret prayer meeting held in a quiet barn or a hidden corner of a home. Think about the courage that took. Every time they gathered, they were risking everything: their property, their freedom, and their families, but their faith was unshakable. They believed they were answering to a higher authority than the King of England. Yet, living under this constant pressure was unsustainable. How could they raise their children in their faith when the state was actively working against them? How could they live authentic lives when they had to hide who they were? It became clear that England could no longer be their home. But where could they go? The world was a vast and intimidating place. The first glimmer of hope came from across the North Sea, in Holland. The Netherlands was known for its relative religious tolerance, a beacon of light in a Europe often torn apart by religious wars. It seemed like the perfect escape. So, in 1608, a brave group from the town of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire made a daring decision. They decided to leave behind everything they had ever known: their homes, their farms, their extended families, the very soil of their homeland, and secretly emigrate to Holland. This wasn't like booking a flight today. It was a perilous, clandestine operation. Their first attempt was betrayed, and they were arrested and jailed. But their resolve didn't break. The following year, they tried again, finally managing to escape to Amsterdam, and later settling in the city of Leiden. In Leiden, they found the freedom they had craved. They could worship openly, without fear of the king's guards breaking down their doors. They established their own church, led by their beloved pastor, John Robinson. For a time, it seemed their dream had come true. They were free, but a new set of challenges soon emerged. While they had religious freedom, life was incredibly hard. Most of them were farmers, but in the bustling urban environment of Leiden, they had to take up low-paying, grueling jobs in the textile industry. They worked long, exhausting hours, and still, poverty was a constant companion. Their children were growing up in a foreign culture, speaking Dutch, and losing their English identity. The Pilgrims worried that their children were also being exposed to the licentious and overly secular nature of Dutch society, which they felt was just as dangerous to their souls as the religious persecution in England. After about a decade in Holland, they looked at their situation and saw a different kind of trap. They had escaped religious persecution only to face cultural assimilation and economic hardship. Their dream of a pure, tight-knit community dedicated to God seemed to be slipping away. They were strangers in a strange land, and they feared their children would forget the very reasons they had left England in the first place. A new, more audacious idea began to take root. What if they could go somewhere completely new? A place where they could build their own society from the ground up, based on their principles. A place where they could be both English and free to practice their faith. Their eyes turned westward, across the vast, forbidding Atlantic Ocean, to the New World America. It was a terrifying prospect. The stories that trickled back from early settlements like Jamestown were filled with tales of starvation, disease, and conflict. The ocean voyage itself was incredibly dangerous, but the alternative, watching their community slowly dissolve in Holland, seemed like a spiritual death. They saw America not as a land of riches, but as a promised land, a wilderness where they could build a new Jerusalem, a place where they could live and worship freely, preserving their English heritage while being governed by their own just and equal laws. This was the ultimate dream of freedom. It wasn't just about escaping something negative. It was about building something positive. It was a vision of a self-governing community, bound together by shared faith and a commitment to each other. They would have to negotiate with English merchants to finance the voyage, find a ship, and recruit others to join them. The risks were monumental, but their conviction was stronger. And so, the stage was set for one of the most famous voyages in history. The Pilgrims, a small group of determined believers forged in the crucible of persecution and hardship, were about to risk everything for a dream. They were ready to leave the old world behind and face the unknown, all for the chance to build a new life, a new society, and a new future, founded on the bedrock of freedom. This deep longing, this unshakable resolve born from years of struggle, is the crucial starting point for everything that follows. In our next chapter, we'll follow them as they prepare for this momentous journey and set sail on a small, battered ship called the Mayflower. Thank you so much for joining me on this first part of our story. I hope it gives you a deeper appreciation for the motivations behind their incredible journey. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss Chapter 2. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey. Last time, we left our separatists as they made the heart-wrenching decision to leave England. Today, we followed them across the North Sea to their first haven, Holland. Why Holland? Well, in the early 1600s, the Netherlands was a beacon of tolerance in Europe, a place where different religious beliefs could coexist, which was exactly what the separatists were looking for. Their first stop was Amsterdam, a bustling, cosmopolitan city. You might think this vibrant hub would be the perfect new home, but it presented a unique problem. The separatists found themselves caught in the middle of existing conflicts within the English refugee community already there. Fearing that these internal squabbles would corrupt their own congregation, they knew they couldn't stay. They needed a place where their community could grow on its own terms, away from outside arguments and distractions. So, after about a year, they packed up once again and moved to the city of Leiden. Leiden was a beautiful university town, known for its intellectual atmosphere and thriving textile industry. It seemed like the perfect place to settle down and build a new life. Here, they could finally worship freely, without fear of persecution. John Robinson, their beloved pastor, was even able to participate in debates at the prestigious Leiden University, and the community found a sense of stability they hadn't known for years. They found a home near the Peterskork, the Grand St. Peter's Church, in a neighborhood that soon became known as the Engels Poort, or English Alley. Here, they built houses, worked, and raised their families. For over a decade, Leiden was their home. They established a life, formed friendships with their Dutch neighbors, and for a while, it seemed like they had finally found their permanent sanctuary. The freedom to practice their faith was a gift. But as the years went on, new challenges began to cast long shadows over their community. Life in Leiden was far from easy. Most of the separatists were farmers from rural England, but in urban Leiden, they had to take up new trades. They became weavers, brewers, carpenters, and tailors. These were difficult, low-paying jobs. The hours were long, and the labor was grueling, often taking a toll on their health. Despite their hard work, many families struggled just to make ends meet. They had religious freedom, yes, but it came at the cost of economic hardships. The constant struggle to provide for their families was a heavy burden, a daily grind that wore them down. Imagine the parents watching their children grow up in this environment. They saw their kids working long hours in difficult conditions, often forgoing education just to help the family survive. This was not the future they had envisioned. They worried that this life of relentless labor was robbing their children of their youth and their English heritage. This brings us to one of their biggest concerns: the cultural challenges. Their children were growing up Dutch. They were speaking Dutch in the streets, playing with Dutch friends, and adopting Dutch customs. While the separatists were grateful to their hosts, they feared losing their own identity. They were, and always would be, English. They wanted to preserve their language, their traditions, and their way of life for future generations. This cultural assimilation felt like a threat to the very core of their community. The Dutch influence, as they saw it, wasn't just about language and customs. Leiden was a very liberal city for its time, and the separatists worried that the city, as more secular and permissive culture, would lead their children astray from their strict religious principles. They saw their children being tempted by lifestyles that went against everything they believed in. The fear that their descendants would forget their faith and their English roots became a constant source of anxiety. Furthermore, the political situation in Europe was becoming increasingly unstable. The 12 years truce, a ceasefire between Spain and the Netherlands, was coming to an end. The separatists feared that war was on the horizon. If Spain, a Catholic powerhouse, were to regain control of the Netherlands, their hard-won religious freedom would vanish overnight. They would be back where they started, or possibly worse. The thought of living under Spanish Catholic rule was terrifying. So, after about 12 years in Leiden, the separatists found themselves at another crossroads. They had escaped persecution in England and found a temporary home in Holland. But life was a constant struggle. Their children were becoming more Dutch than English, and the threat of war loomed large. They were grateful for their time in Leiden, but they knew it could not be their final destination. They needed a place where they could be both English and free, to practice their faith. A place where they could build a society from the ground up, based on their own values. And so, their eyes began to turn westward, across the vast and intimidating Atlantic Ocean. They started to dream of a new world, a place where they could create their own New England. It was a radical, daunting idea fraught with unimaginable risks. But for a community that had already sacrificed so much for their beliefs, the possibility of true freedom was a beacon of hope powerful enough to face any danger. Their time in Holland, with all its trials and tribulations, had prepared them for the next, and most famous, chapter of their incredible story. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explored this crucial, yet often overlooked, part of the Pilgrim story. Their stop in Holland was a defining period that shaped their decision to embark on their legendary voyage. What do you think was the biggest factor in their decision to leave Leiden? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss the next chapter of our journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. In our last episode, we left the English separatists in Leiden, Holland. They had found religious freedom, but life was far from perfect. Their children were losing their English identity. The work was grueling, and the looming threat of war between the Dutch and the Spanish cast a long, dark shadow over their future. They were at a crossroads, facing a monumental decision that would change the course of history forever. This is the story of that decision. The choice to cross a vast, dangerous ocean in search of a new home. Imagine the conversations that must have filled their homes in Leiden. The elders, weary from years of struggle, debating the risks. The younger generation, perhaps a mix of fearful and excited, listening intently. Was it better to stay in a land that offered religious tolerance but was slowly eroding their culture, or to venture into the complete unknown? They were, as their leader William Bradford would later write, hunted and persecuted on every side. The truce with Spain was ending, and the flames of war were about to be rekindled. Staying in Leiden meant potentially being caught in the crossfire of a brutal European conflict. The idea of America, the New World, began to take root. It wasn't a new concept. English colonies, like Jamestown in Virginia, had already been established, though with mixed and often brutal results. But for the separatists, America represented something more than just economic opportunity. It was a chance to build a society from the ground up, based on their own religious principles. A place where they could live as Englishmen and women, and worship God freely without interference. It was a blank canvas, a remote, desolate wilderness, as they called it. But it was a wilderness that offered the promise of true autonomy. Of course, the dangers were immense and terrifying. The Atlantic Ocean was a formidable barrier. In the early 17th century, a transatlantic voyage was a life-threatening ordeal. Ships were small, cramped, and at the mercy of violent storms. Disease could spread like wildfire in the tight quarters, and the journey could take months. There were tales of starvation, shipwrecks, and pirates, and even if they survived the crossing, what awaited them? A wilderness filled with unknown dangers, unfamiliar peoples, and the harsh reality of building a new life with nothing but their bare hands and their faith. The debate was intense. Some argued for heading to Guyana in South America, praising its warm climate and fertile lands. But others feared the tropical diseases and the proximity to the Spanish, their old persecutors. Virginia was another option. It was an established English territory, which offered some level of protection and familiarity. However, it was also under the authority of the Church of England. Would they simply be trading one form of religious oversight for another? Could they truly be separate in a colony, governed by the very institution they had fled? This was the critical point. They didn't just want to move. They wanted to build their own community, governed by their own rules and their own interpretation of the Bible. They needed to find a place where they could secure a land patent, a legal right to the land that would also grant them the freedom to worship as they pleased. This required delicate and complex negotiations. They were a small, relatively poor community. They couldn't fund such an epic expedition on their own. They needed investors, merchant adventurers from London who were willing to finance the voyage in exchange for a share of the future profits from the colony profits from fishing, fur trading, and timber. So they sent two of their own, Robert Cushman and John Carver, to London to begin these crucial negotiations. Their mission was twofold: secure a patent for land in North America and, just as importantly, find the money to get there. It was a daunting task. They had to convince shrewd businessmen that their small band of religious dissenters was a worthy investment. They had to navigate the political landscape of King James's court, assuring the authorities that they would be loyal English subjects, despite their nonconformist beliefs. The negotiations dragged on for months, filled with setbacks and frustrations. At one point, a patent was secured for settlement in Virginia, but the terms were not ideal. The financial backers, a group led by a man named Thomas Weston, drove a hard bargain. They insisted that the colonists would have to work for the joint company for 7 years, with all profits and property held in common until the end of the term. This was a bitter pill for many of the separatists to swallow. It felt like a form of indentured servitude, delaying the personal independence they so desperately craved. Meanwhile, back in Leiden, the congregation waited anxiously. As news of the difficult negotiations trickled in, doubts began to surface again. The sheer scale of the undertaking was becoming terrifyingly real. William Bradford eloquently captured their fears. He wrote of the miseries of the land they were heading to, the cruel and savage native people, and the overwhelming feeling of leaving everything familiar behind to face a sea of troubles. Yet, in the face of all this fear, their faith held firm. They believed they were instruments of God's will. They fasted and prayed, seeking divine guidance for their decision. It was in this atmosphere of fear and faith that the final decision was made. The majority, inspired by their leaders like John Robinson and William Brewster, resolved to go. They saw it as their sacred duty. They were not just adventurers seeking gold. They were pilgrims on a spiritual quest. This is a crucial distinction. The term pilgrim, which we so famously associate with them, comes from Bradford's own writing, describing how they knew they were pilgrims and looked to the heavens as their dearest country. With the decision made, a new phase of frantic activity began. They had to decide who would go first. The congregation was too large, and the resources too slim for everyone to travel at once. It was decided that a smaller group, the youngest and strongest, would be the vanguard. They would pave the way, and the rest, including their beloved pastor John Robinson, would follow later. This meant families would be split apart, perhaps forever. The farewells were heartbreaking. Bradford described the scene of their departure from Leiden as a sad and mournful sight, with tears streaming down the faces of those leaving and those staying behind. They purchased a small ship, the Speedwell, to take them from Holland to England, where they would join a larger vessel, the Mayflower, which had been hired by the merchant adventurers. Along with the Mayflower would come other colonists, people recruited by the investors who were not part of their church. The separatists called these other strangers. This joining of saints and strangers would create a new, complex dynamic on board the ship and in the future colony. They were now a mixed company, bound together not by a shared faith, but by a shared, perilous venture. And so, after years of prayer, debate, and negotiation, the moment had arrived. They had sold their homes and possessions, said their tearful goodbyes, and committed themselves to the mercy of God and the sea. They were leaving the old world behind, with all its comforts and persecutions, for the vast, terrifying, and hopeful promise of the new. The decision was made. The journey was about to begin. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of the story. The next part of our journey will take us onto the high seas, aboard the Mayflower and the Speedwell, as this brave group begins their legendary voyage. If you're enjoying this series, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. We'll see you then. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Last time, we left our group of separatists, soon to be known as the Pilgrims, as they made the momentous decision to leave Holland for the New World. Today, in Chapter 4, we're diving into the nitty-gritty of how you actually prepare for such an epic, life-altering voyage. It wasn't as simple as booking a ticket and packing a suitcase. This was a massive undertaking, a logistical puzzle where every single piece was crucial for survival. So, how did they begin? The first and most critical step was securing passage. This meant finding ships. Not just any ships, but vessels sturdy enough to cross the treacherous Atlantic Ocean and large enough to carry over 100 people. Plus, all their worldly possessions and the supplies needed to start a new colony from scratch. The group managed to acquire 2 ships for their journey. The Speedwell and the more famous of the pair, the Mayflower. Let's talk about the Speedwell first. This was the smaller of the 2 vessels, weighing about 60 tons. The Pilgrims actually purchased this ship themselves in Holland. Their plan was for the Speedwell to carry the Leiden congregation to England, where they would join the other passengers. Then, it would make the transatlantic crossing alongside the Mayflower. After arriving in America, the Speedwell was intended to stay with the colonists, serving as a vital tool for fishing, trading, and exploring the coastline of their new home. It was an investment in their future, a floating piece of their new life. Then, there was the Mayflower. The Mayflower was a much larger ship, a typical English merchant vessel of the time, estimated to be around 180 tons. Unlike the Speedwell, the Mayflower was a chartered, or rented, ship. Its primary job was one way: get the passengers and their cargo safely across the Atlantic. Its master, Christopher Jones, and his crew were hired professionals, not colonists. The Mayflower was the workhorse, the main transport, the vessel that would carry the bulk of the people and the hopes of this fledgling community. The plan was for these 2 ships, a mismatched but determined pair, to sail in tandem, providing mutual support on their long journey west. With the ship secured, the next monumental task was provisioning. Imagine you're moving to a place with no stores, no farms, no houses, and no certainty of what you'll find. You have to pack everything you need, not just for the 2 to 3 month journey, but for the entire first year until you can plant and harvest your own crops. The scale of this is just staggering. The Pilgrims had to think of everything. Let's start with food. The staple of any long-sea voyage in the 17th century was something called hardtack or ship-s biscuit. This was a simple, very hard flour and water biscuit, baked multiple times to remove all moisture. It was incredibly durable and could last for years. But it was also notoriously tough to eat, often infested with weevils, and had to be soaked in beer, water, or soup to be edible. It wasn't gourmet, but it was calories. Alongside the hardtack, they packed salted and dried meats, primarily beef and pork, and salted fish like cod. Salting was the primary method of preservation. The meat would be packed in barrels layered with salt, drawing out the moisture and preventing They also had barrels of dried peas and beans, which were a good source of protein. Cheese, especially hard cheeses, could also last for a while, as could tubs of butter. And what did they drink? Water stored in wooden casks for months at sea would quickly become slimy and undrinkable. The solution was beer. Everyone, including children, drank what was known as small beer. It had a very low alcohol content, but the brewing process killed off harmful bacteria, making it much safer to drink than stored water. They loaded thousands of gallons of it. Beer wasn't for getting tipsy. It was for staying hydrated and healthy. Beyond the food for the journey, they had to pack for the future. This meant bringing seeds. They carefully selected seeds for crops they knew how to grow and that would be suitable for the new climate: wheat, rye, barley, peas, and various garden vegetables. These seeds were their lifeline for the following year. They also brought tools, not just a hammer and a few nails, but everything needed to build a town from the ground up. Saws, axes, adzes for shaping wood, hammers, nails, shovels, and hoes. They needed blacksmithing tools to forge and repair their own equipment, and carpentry tools to build their homes and furniture. They also packed livestock. While it's hard to know the exact number, it's believed they brought some chickens, and possibly a few pigs and goats on board. Can you imagine sharing a crowded ship with farm animals for 2 months? It must have been an incredibly noisy and smelly experience. These animals were the breeding stock for their future farms. Then there were household goods. Each family brought what they could. This included cooking pots, pans, pewter dishes, and utensils. They brought bedding, linens, and any spare clothing they had. Remember, there were no clothing stores waiting for them. What they brought had to last. They also packed spinning wheels and looms to make their own cloth from flax or wool in the future. Of course, given the potential dangers from both wild animals and unknown native populations, they had to be prepared for defense. They brought armor, including helmets and cuirasses, muskets, gunpowder, and shot. These weren't just for defense, but also for hunting. A skilled hunter could supplement their diet with game, which would be a welcome relief from salted meat and hot. Finally, they packed items for trade. They knew they would encounter Native American tribes, and peaceful relations would be essential. They brought glass beads, small mirrors, copper kettles, and other trinkets. They hoped to trade for food, furs, or information. So, you have these 2 ships, the Speedwell in Holland and the Mayflower waiting in England, being loaded to the brim with a mountain of supplies. Barrels of beef, biscuits, and beer. Crates of tools, seeds, and muskets. Chests filled with personal belongings, and all of it had to be carefully catalogued and stowed to keep the ship balanced and the provisions accessible. It was a monumental, expensive, and exhausting preparation. Every barrel packed, every tool loaded, was an act of faith in their mission, faith in each other, and faith that they would survive to build a new life in a distant, unknown land. The stage was set. The supplies were gathered. All that was left was to cast off the lines and begin the voyage. Thank you so much for joining me. For this part of the story, it's in these details that we truly understand the courage and determination of these families. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter, where the journey finally begins. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. When we last left our Pilgrims, they were finally setting sail for the new world aboard 2 ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Hopes were high, but as we'll see, the sea had other plans. Their grand departure from Southampton on August 5th, 1620, was almost immediately troubled. They hadn't sailed far before the Speedwell. The smaller of the 2 vessels began taking on water. Alarmed, the captains turned back, making for Dartmouth to assess the damage. In Dartmouth, shipwrights inspected the Speedwell thoroughly. They found a leak, putched it up, and declared the ship seaworthy. After a frustrating delay of more than a week, the Pilgrims once again set sail. You can imagine their relief, mixed with a lingering anxiety. Was the Speedwell truly fixed? Teoped so. The dream of a new life was so close, yet the vast Atlantic still lay before them. The crew and passengers settled into their routines, their eyes fixed on the western horizon, praying for a smooth and uneventful passage. But fate, it seemed, was not on their side. They had sailed about 300 miles past Land's End, the southwestern tip of England, when the cry went up again. The speedwell is leaking. This time it was serious. Water was pouring into the hull faster than the pumps could handle. The ship was, as William Bradford later wrote, overmasted, meaning its masts were too large for its frame. Under the strain of full sail, the hull would warp and open up, letting in the sea. It was a critical design flaw. And out here, in the open ocean, it was a death sentence. A frantic conference was held between the masters of the two ships. The decision was agonizing but necessary. They had to turn back. To continue on would be to risk the lives of everyone aboard the Speedwell. The mood must have been devastating. Twice they had tried, and twice they had failed. The provisions were dwindling. The season was growing late, and their spirits were sinking lower than the leaking ship. They limped back to port, this time to Plymouth, England, a place that would soon lend its name to their future home. Once ashore in Plymouth, the reality of their situation became starkly clear. The Speedwell was simply not fit for the Atlantic crossing. Some historians even whisper that its master, Mr. Reynolds, may have intentionally sabotaged his own ship, either because he was afraid of the voyage or because he wanted to get out of his contract. Whatever the reason, the decision was final. The Speedwell would go no further. The saints and strangers now faced a heart-wrenching choice. Who would continue the journey, and who would be left behind? The group's leaders, including John Carver and William Brewster, had to make some tough decisions. There wasn't enough room for everyone on the Mayflower. Some passengers, their courage broken by the repeated setbacks, willingly gave up and returned to London or Leiden. Others, like Robert Cushman and his family, who had been instrumental in organizing the voyage, had to stay behind due to the lack of space. It was a moment of profound disappointment and separation, as friends and families were split apart. The remaining supplies and as many passengers as could possibly fit were crammed onto the already crowded Mayflower. Imagine the scene. What was once a ship carrying its own company now had to absorb people and provisions from another. Over 100 souls, men, women, and children were now packed into a vessel roughly 90 feet long. The space between decks, where most passengers would live for the next 2 months, was cramped, dark, and would soon become foul. The sense of claustrophobia must have been immense. And so, on September 6th, 1620, nearly a month after their first attempt, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, alone. This time, there was no turning back. The lone ship pointed its bow toward the vast, unpredictable Atlantic. Aboard were about 102 passengers and a crew of about 30, all placing their lives and futures in the hands of God and the strength of their small wooden vessel. They were leaving everything they knew behind for a promise, a hope of freedom in a land they had never seen. The atmosphere on board was a mixture of grim determination and fervent prayer. The passengers were a diverse group. There were the separatists from Leiden, seeking religious freedom, whom we call the Pilgrims. And then there were the strangers, a group of merchants, craftsmen, and indentured servants, recruited by the London investors to help make the colony profitable. These two groups, with different motivations and backgrounds, were now confined together, their destinies intertwined on this single, solitary ship. The voyage they were about to undertake was perilous. They were sailing at the height of the North Atlantic storm season, a period known for its violent gales and monstrous waves. They had no accurate maps, no weather forecasts, only a compass, and the stars to guide them. Every creak of the ship's timbers, every crash of a wave against the hull, would be a reminder of their vulnerability. They were a tiny speck of humanity adrift on an immense and unforgiving ocean, sailing toward an unknown future. The Mayflower was alone, but it carried the seeds of a new nation. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter of the Pilgrims' story. It's a testament to their incredible resilience and faith that they persevered through so many setbacks. What do you think you would have done in their shoes? Let me know in the comments below. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please do forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chapter of their incredible voyage. We'll see you next time. Video opens with a shot of a historical map of the Atlantic Ocean, with a dotted line tracing a path from England to North America. The sound of creaking wood and gentle waves can be heard. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. In our last chapter, we left our brave separatists, the Pilgrims, as they finally set sail from Plymouth, England, aboard a single, crowded vessel, the Mayflower. Today, we embark with them on Chapter 6, the perilous Atlantic journey. Imagine leaving everything you've ever known for a promise of freedom, a promise that lies on the other side of a vast, unpredictable ocean. This wasn't just a trip. It was a 66-day ordeal that would test the limits of their faith, endurance, and very will to survive. Scene transitions to an animated graphic or reenactment showing the cramped conditions below deck on the Mayflower. The space is dark, low-ceilinged, and filled with people and supplies. Let's first talk about their living quarters. The Mayflower was a cargo ship, not a passenger liner. It was about 100 feet long, and most of its 102 passengers were crammed into the 'tween deck. A damp and airless space between the main deck and the cargo hold, with a ceiling barely 5 feet high. Most adults couldn't even stand up straight. Families were packed together in small, makeshift cabins, with little to no privacy. The air would have been thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the constant dampness seeping through the wooden planks. There were no windows, only the dim, flickering light of oil lamps, making the days and nights blur into one long, claustrophobic twilight. This was their entire world for over 2 months. Sound of a storm building, wind howling, waves crashing, visuals of dark, stormy seas. Just a few weeks into their voyage, the unforgiving nature of the Atlantic revealed itself. The autumn seas are notorious for their violent storms, and the Mayflower was tossed about like a toy. Imagine being huddled in that dark space below deck as colossal waves crashed over the ship. The sounds would have been terrifying. The groaning of the ship's timbers, the roar of the wind, and the thunderous impact of water against the hull. The ship's seams began to leak, and icy seawater would cascade down onto the passengers, soaking their clothes, their bedding, and their meager possessions. There was no escape from the cold and the dampness. Visuals focus on individuals looking pale and ill, reenacting seasickness. For nearly everyone on board, seasickness was a constant, miserable companion. In such violent seas, it was inescapable. The relentless rocking and pitching of the ship induced a debilitating nausea that left many too weak to even move. In their cramped quarters, this only added to the unsanitary conditions. It was a physical and mental battle. William Bradford, who would later become the governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote about these times, describing how people were not able to go to stand upon the decks. Their bodies were battered and bruised from being thrown against the ship's walls, and their spirits were constantly tested by the unending misery. Scene shows a depiction of daily life, simple meals being prepared, people mending clothes, or trying to read by dim light. So, how did they survive day to day? Life was a monotonous, grueling routine. Their diet consisted mainly of hardtack, a rock-hard biscuit, salted beef or pork, and dried peas. Water stored in barrels quickly became stagnant and unpleasant. Cooking was extremely dangerous and often impossible during storms, meaning many meals were eaten cold. The passengers had to find ways to pass the long hours. They prayed, they sang psalms, and the literate would read the Bible aloud to offer comfort and hope to the group. The children, cooped up with no space to run or play, would have grown restless and weary. It was a community bound by shared hardship, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in the most abnormal of circumstances. Animation or illustration showing the main beam of the Mayflower cracking. The journey was not just uncomfortable, it was perilous. At one point, about halfway across the Atlantic, the ship faced during a particularly fierce storm. A crucial main beam in the ship's hull cracked with a deafening snap. Water began pouring in more heavily. For a moment, it seemed their voyage was doomed. Panic must have gripped everyone. The ship's master and crew debated turning back, admitting defeat. But the Pilgrims had brought along a large iron screw from a printing press. In a remarkable feat of ingenuity and desperation, they used this screwjack to force the cracked beam back into place, securing it with a post. This makeshift repair held, allowing them to continue their journey. But it was a stark reminder of how close they were to disaster at any given moment. Visual shows a young man being swept overboard and then pulled back on deck. The danger wasn't just to the ship, but to the people. In one of these violent storms, a young servant named John Howland was swept off the deck and into the churning, icy ocean. In what can only be described as a miracle, as he was going under, his hand managed to grab hold of a trailing rope from the topsail. He held on for dear life as he was dragged through the waves until the crew managed to haul him back on board with a boat hook. Though he was sick for some time after, he survived. This event was seen by the Pilgrims as a clear sign of God's providence, a reaffirmation that they were being watched over. It was a moment of terror that turned into a powerful symbol of hope. A softer, more reflective tone. Visuals show a baby being born and a person passing away, representing the cycle of life. Amidst the struggle and fear, life and death continued their cycle. One passenger, a servant to Samuel Fuller, tragically passed away and was buried at sea. A somber moment for the small community. Yet, in the midst of this loss, there was new life. A baby boy was born to Elizabeth Hopkins, who named him Oceanus, in honor of his birthplace. This single birth was a powerful symbol of the future. It was a tangible sign of hope, a reminder of the new life and new society they were risking everything to build. The birth of Oceanus aboard the ship was a testament to their resilience and their unyielding belief in the promise of a new beginning. Scene shifts to a view from the ship, with land faintly visible on the horizon. The sun is breaking through the clouds. Closing parentheses. Finally, after 66 long, arduous days at sea, on November 9th, 1620, a cry went up from the lookout. Land ho! The sight of the shores of Cape Cod must have been the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. The relief, the joy, the overwhelming emotion is almost impossible for us to imagine. They had done it. They had crossed the perilous Atlantic. But their journey was far from over. They had arrived in a new world, far north of their intended destination in Virginia, with winter fast approaching. New challenges and new dangers lay just ahead. Thank you so much for joining me on this leg of the Mayflowers. Incredible story. The courage and perseverance of these individuals in the face of such overwhelming odds is truly humbling. If you found this chapter compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you next time as we explore their arrival and the drafting of the historic Mayflower Compact. Thanks for watching. 0 o'clock to 0:15. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into a story that's almost too incredible to be true. A tale of hope, born in the middle of the vast, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean. We're going back in time to the year 1620, aboard a small, cramped ship called the Mayflower. 0:15 to 0:30. Imagine this. You're one of about 100 passengers, plus a crew of 30, packed onto a vessel barely 100 feet long. You've been at sea for weeks, tossed about by violent storms, facing sickness, uncertainty, and the immense, gray expanse of the ocean in every direction. The dream of a new life is all that keeps you going. 0:30 to 0:45. Among these hopeful souls were Stephen and Elizabeth Hopkins. They weren't just a couple. They were a family, traveling with their children from a previous marriage. And Elizabeth was carrying a secret, a new life growing within her, a baby who was about to make its grand entrance into one of the most dramatic settings imaginable. 0:45 to 1 o'clock, as the Mayflower creaked and groaned through the turbulent waters, Elizabeth went into labor. Think about the conditions: snow-sterile hospital room, no modern medical equipment, just the support of the other women on board and the rhythmic crash of waves against the hull. It was a moment of immense vulnerability and incredible strength. 1 o'clock to 1:15, and in the midst of this chaos, a baby was born. A healthy baby boy. In a world defined by the endless water surrounding them, his parents gave him a name that perfectly captured his extraordinary birthplace. They named him Oceanus Hopkins. The name itself is a poem, a testament to his arrival. 115 to 130, the birth of Oceanus was more than just a family event. It was a profound symbol of hope for everyone on that ship. In a journey filled with hardship and loss, sadly, one passenger had already died at Sita's tiny, crying baby was a powerful sign of new beginnings. He was a tangible promise of the future they were all sailing towards. 130 to 145, his arrival must have been a beacon of light in the darkness. It shifted the atmosphere on the Mayflower, reminding everyone of the very reason they had embarked on this perilous voyage: to build a new world, to create a future for their children and their children's children. Oceanus was the first of that new generation. Born not in England, not yet in America, but in the space in between. 1:45 to 2 o'clock, he was a child of the Atlantic, a citizen of the sea. William Bradford, the future governor of Plymouth Colony, even documented the birth in his famous journal of Plymouth Plantation, cementing Oceanus's place in history. It was an event significant enough to be recorded for all time. 2 o'clock to 2:15 now. You might think that a baby born in such harsh conditions would have a fragile start to life, and you'd be right. The first winter in Plymouth was brutal. The Pilgrims were unprepared for the harsh New England climate. Food was scarce, and disease spread quickly through the fledgling settlement. 2:15 to 2:30. The casualty rate was staggering. Nearly half of the Mayflower passengers and crew did not survive that first winter. It was a period known as the general sickness, or the starving time. It's heartbreaking to imagine the loss and the daily struggle for survival these pioneers faced. 2:32 to 45 among the families. The Hopkins family was also touched by this tragedy, but Stephen and Elizabeth, along with their children, including little Oceanus, managed to survive. It's a testament to their resilience, and perhaps a little bit of luck. The Hopkins household was one of the few to make it through that first winter entirely intact. 2:45 to 3 o'clock. Stephen Hopkins himself was a fascinating character. He was one of the few passengers who had prior experience in the New World. Years earlier, he had been shipwrecked in Bermuda on his way to Jamestown. His experiences there gave him valuable knowledge about survival and dealing with Native American populations, which proved crucial for the Plymouth colony. Las tres y quince. Solita Oceanus grew up in this brand new world, a world his parents had risked everything to reach. He was a toddler during the famous First Thanksgiving Feast in 1621, a moment of shared celebration and gratitude between the English colonists and their Wampanoag neighbors. 3:15 to 3:30, can you picture it? A little boy, born on the ocean, now taking his first steps on solid ground, surrounded by the sights and sounds of a land that was both strange and full of promise. He would have heard the mix of English and Algonquian languages, a true child of this cultural intersection. 3:30 to 3, raped sadly. The story of Oceanus Hopkins is a short one. The same records that tell us of his miraculous birth also tell us of his early death. He passed away before the 1623 division of land, meaning he was likely no more than 2 or 3 years old. The records don't state the cause of his death, but in an era of high infant mortality and rough living conditions, it was an all too common tragedy. 3:45 to 4 o'clock. It's a poignant end to a story that began with such hope. It was a symbol of a new beginning, but he didn't get to see that new world fully blossom. His life was a brief but powerful chapter in the larger saga of the Mayflower Pilgrims. 4 o'clock to 4:15, but his story doesn't truly end there. The name Oceanus lives on, a unique and beautiful name that instantly tells a story of courage and adventure. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about individual human lives, filled with moments of fear, joy, and incredible hope. 4:15 to 4:30, the birth of Oceanus Hopkins aboard the Mayflower is a powerful metaphor. It represents the birth of a new nation, conceived in a difficult and dangerous passage, yet full of promise. It's a reminder that even in the most challenging of circumstances, new life and new hope can emerge. 4:30 to 4:45, his short life highlights the immense sacrifices made by these early settlers. They faced a reality we can barely comprehend, and every success, every survival, was a victory. Oceanus, in his brief time, was one of those victories. He was proof that they could endure, that life could continue, even in the middle of the ocean. Las 4:45, las 5 so. The next time you hear the story of the Mayflower, Don't just think of the Pilgrims in their black hats. Think of Elizabeth Hopkins, giving birth in a rolling ship. Think of a tiny baby named Oceanus, whose first lullaby was the sound of the Atlantic, and whose existence gave 100 weary travelers a reason to keep believing. 5 o'clock to 5:15. His story is a small but essential piece of the American tapestry, a thread of pure, unadulterated hope woven into the very beginning of the colonial narrative. It's a human story, a family story, and it's a story that deserves to be remembered. 5:15 to 5:30. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. I find stories like this so fascinating because they connect us to the real people behind the history we learn in school. What do you think about the name Ocean? Let me know in the comments below. 5:30 to 5:45. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more incredible stories from the past, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure into history. 5:45 to 6 o'clock. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay curious. Stay curious. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the Pilgrims' voyage. Last time, we left our travelers battling a fierce storm, a moment so terrifying that it cracked one of the Mayflower's massive main beams. It was a close call, a real test of their resolve and their ship. But with courage, a giant iron screw, and a lot of prayer, they managed to repair the beam and continue their perilous journey westward. They were battered, but not broken, and the vast, empty Atlantic still stretched before them. Today, in Chapter 8, we reach a pivotal moment, the moment they've been dreaming of for months. Imagine being on that ship. It's been over 2 months since you last saw solid ground. 66 long, grueling days. The conditions are grim. The ship is crowded, damp, and cold. The food is monotonous and dwindling salty. Hardtack biscuits and dried meat. Sickness has already claimed one life, and many a week. The endless, rolling gray of the ocean is all you've known. Every sunrise brings the same view. Water, water, and more water. Hope is a flickering candle in a storm. The children, cooped up for so long, are restless and frail. The adults are weary, their spirits worn thin by the constant motion of the ship and the uncertainty of their future. They've sacrificed everything: their homes, their communities, their sense of security, all for the promise of a new life, a place where they could worship freely. But after weeks of this relentless voyage, even the strongest faith must have been tested. Did they make the right choice? Will this journey ever end? These are the questions that must have haunted their waking hours and their fitful sleep. But then, one morning, something changes. It's November 9th, 1620. A cry rings out from the lookout in the masthead. It's a shout that electrifies the entire ship, a word everyone has been desperate to hear. Land. Imagine this scene. People would have scrambled from below deck, their faces pale and drawn, squinting into the distance. And there it is. Not a mirage, not a trick of the light, but a definite, solid line on the horizon, a smudge of darkness against the morning sky. It's land. Real, tangible land. The relief must have been overwhelming. Tears of joy would have streamed down weathered faces. Hugs would have been exchanged between strangers who had become family through shared hardship. Prayers of thanks would have risen from every corner of the deck. After weeks of staring at an empty horizon, the sight of shore was more than just a geographical landmark. It was a sign of deliverance. It was proof that their ordeal was finally nearing its end. Their gamble, their leap of faith, had brought them to the edge of a new world. The land they spotted was the long, sandy arm of Cape Cod, its shores lined with dunes and scrubby pines. As they drew closer, the details would have become clearer. The smell of the air would have changed, losing its pure, salty tang and taking on the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and decaying leaves. The scent of life. They could hear the roar of the surf crashing against the shore, a sound so different from the endless slosh of the open ocean. They might have even seen gulls circling overhead, a sure sign that their sea-bound prison was behind them. But amidst the celebration, a new reality began to set in. A quick check of their navigational instruments brought a startling realization. This wasn't Virginia. They were hundreds of miles north of their intended destination, the mouth of the Hudson River, where their patent from the Virginia Company gave them legal permission to settle. They had been blown far off course by the relentless storms of the North Atlantic. So here they were, looking at a shore they had no legal right to be on. They were outside the jurisdiction of their English charter. This presented a massive problem. What were they to do? Their patent was invalid here. The rules and laws they had planned to live under were suddenly null and void. They were, in a sense, adrift once more, not on the ocean, but in a sea of legal and political uncertainty. The leaders, men like William Bradford, John Carver, and William Brewster, would have gathered to discuss this new predicament. The joy of landfall was quickly tempered by the gravity of their situation. Turning south to Virginia was a risky option. Winter was fast approaching. The seas around Cape Cod were notoriously treacherous, with hidden sandbars and dangerous shoals that could easily wreck the Mayflower. Their supplies were already critically low, especially fresh water and firewood. The thought of spending several more weeks at sea, navigating dangerous, unknown waters, was a terrifying prospect. Sickness was already a problem, and a longer voyage would only make it worse. On the other hand, staying put meant they were essentially squatters. They would be starting their new society without any legal foundation, without the authority of the English crown to back them up. This was a recipe for chaos. Some of the passengers, particularly the strangers, those who weren't part of the core separatist group, began to murmur. They argued that since they were not in Virginia, the contracts they had signed as indentured servants were no longer binding. They could go their own way, do as they pleased. The threat of mutiny and the complete collapse of their community was very real. The dream of a unified, orderly society was hanging by a thread. They had survived the ocean, only to face a crisis of their own making on the shores of their promised land. The sight of land wasn't the end of their troubles. It was the beginning of a whole new set. They were safe from the sea, but now they had to figure out how to survive each other and the challenges of this wild, new continent. Their decision would be one of the most important in American history. It would force them to create their own government, to write their own rules, and to forge a new social contract right there on the deck of the Mayflower. The land was in sight, but the path to building a new world was just beginning, and it was fraught with dangers they were only just starting to understand. What they do next is a story of incredible foresight and political genius, and we'll dive deep into that in our next chapter. They're at a crossroads, and their choice will shape the future of a nation. Thanks for watching this part of our story. If you're finding this journey as fascinating as I am, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next chapter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we've reached a pivotal moment in our story. Chapter 9. The signing of the Mayflower Compact. This isn't just about a dusty old document. It's about a group of desperate people on the edge of a vast, unknown wilderness, making a promise that would shape the future of a nation. So, let's set the scene. After more than 2 grueling months at sea, the Mayflower finally spotted land. But it wasn't Virginia, their intended destination. Instead, they were anchored off the coast of what we now know as Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This presented a huge problem. Their legal patent, their permission to settle, was only valid for Virginia. Here, hundreds of miles to the north, they were essentially in a lawless land. They had no official charter, no government, and no rules to bind them. You can imagine the tension brewing on that cramped ship. The passengers were a mixed group. About half were the saints, the religious separatists we often call pilgrims, seeking freedom to practice their faith. The other half were the strangers, a collection of merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, and indentured servants, all seeking economic opportunity or a new start. These 2 groups had very different motivations and didn't always see eye to eye, with the ship anchored in this new, unauthorized territory. Some of the strangers started to make what were described as discontented and mutinous speeches. Their argument was simple. Since they weren't in Virginia, the contract they had signed with the financial backers in London was void. Once they stepped ashore, they would be free agents. They would, and I quote, use their own liberty, for none had power to command them. This was a recipe for disaster. Anarchy was knocking at the door. If everyone just went their own way, survival in this harsh new world would be impossible. The colony would collapse before it even began. The Pilgrim leaders, men like William Bradford and John Carver, knew they had to act fast. They understood that their survival depended entirely on their ability to stick together. They needed a framework, a social glue, to hold their fragile community together through the brutal winter they knew was coming. They needed to establish a government, but one that derived its power not from a king or a company back in England, but from the people themselves. This was a radical idea for the 17th century. So, before anyone set foot on land, they gathered the men together in the great cabin of the Mayflower. It was there, on November 11th, 1620, according to their calendar, that they drafted and signed a remarkable agreement, the Mayflower Compact. Let's talk about what the compact actually said. It's surprisingly short and to the point. It wasn't a constitution with complex laws and articles. It was, at its heart, a promise. The document starts by professing loyalty to King James, a smart political move to show they weren't rebels. It then states their purpose for the voyage: for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our king and country. But the most important part comes next. The signers covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Let's break that down. Covenant is a powerful, solemn word, often with religious overtones, meaning a sacred promise. Combine ourselves together emphasizes unity, and civil body politic means they are forming a government, a state. They created this government for a clear purpose, for our better ordering and preservation. In other words, for survival. And how would this government work? T pled it, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet, and convene for the general good of the colony. This is the core of the agreement. They were giving themselves the power to create their own laws and elect their own leaders. And here's the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Every single signer promised all due submission and obedience to Tosi Lows. It didn't matter if you were a saint or a stranger. Once the community, through its elected government, made a law for the general good, everyone had to follow it. This was the principle of self-government, based on the consent of the governed. In total, 41 of the adult male passengers signed the compact. This act of signing was incredibly significant. It wasn't a decree from a monarch. It was a social contract created by the people who would be governed by it. It established that the power to rule came from within the community itself, not from some distant authority. It was a simple, practical solution to a life or death problem. By signing, they transformed themselves from a chaotic crowd of individuals into an organized society. They chose John Carver as their first governor, and with his new framework in place, they were finally ready to face the challenges of the new world as a unified group. The Mayflower Compact provided the legal and social foundation they desperately needed. It was a commitment to cooperation, to the rule of law, and to the idea that their collective survival depended on their ability to work together for the common good. This short document, drafted out of necessity in the cabin of a small ship, would become a cornerstone of American democracy. It was one of the first examples of a government based on a written agreement by the people, and its principles would echo through the centuries, influencing the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. It was a bold step, a declaration that even in the wilderness, they would be a community of laws, not of men. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the Mayflower Compact. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest ideas are born from the most challenging circumstances. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue our historical journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we dive into Chapter 10, Exploring the New Land. The Mayflower is safely anchored in what is now Provincetown Harbor, but the real work has just begun. The year is 1620. It's late November, and a biting winter is closing in fast. The Pilgrims, weary from their long voyage, know they cannot stay on the ship forever. They need to find a suitable place to build their homes. A place with fresh water, fertile soil, and a defensible position. So, What happens next is a series of desperate and daring expeditions into the unknown wilderness of Cape Cod. The first challenge, they didn't have a proper boat for scouting the shallow coastline. The shallop, a small sailing boat they brought in pieces from England, was in bad shape. It had been stored between decks and was battered by the sea journey. The ship's carpenter gets to work, but repairs are slow, impatient, and anxious. A group of 16 men, led by the capable Captain Miles Standish, decide they can't wait. Armed with muskets, swords, and armor, they persuade Governor Carver to let them go ashore and explore by foot. This is the first time any of them have set foot in their new world. Imagine the scene as they are rowed to the sandy beach. The air is frigid, the landscape barren and unwelcoming. They marched single file along the coast, a strange sight in their heavy European clothing. Almost immediately, they spot a group of 5 or 6 people with a dog in the distance. These are the first native people they've seen. The figures notice the Englishmen and dart into the woods, vanishing before any contact can be made. The Pilgrims, both curious and cautious, follow their tracks, hoping to learn something about the inhabitants of this land. Their pursuit leads them inland, through dense thickets and over steep hills. The journey is grueling. The men, unaccustomed to such rugged terrain, are scratched by branches and exhausted by the unfamiliar landscape. As dusk falls, they make a makeshift camp, setting up a 3-man watch to guard against the unknown dangers of the night. That first night on shore must have been filled with a mix of fear and anticipation, huddled around a small fire as the strange sounds of the wilderness echoed around them. The next day, their exploration continues. Thirst becomes a pressing issue. They had brought biscuits and Dutch cheese, but their flasks of aquavita, a strong spirit, were not enough. Finally, they find what they've been desperately searching for: a spring of fresh water. William Bradford would later write about the simple joy of that moment, calling it the first New England water they had tasted, describing it as being as pleasant unto them as wine or beer had been in 4 times. It's a small but profound moment of relief in a harsh environment. Pushing further, they stumble upon a remarkable discovery: an old cornfield. In it, they find several large, sand-covered mounds. Digging into one, they unearth a large basket filled with about 3 or 4 bushels of dried corn kernels. Some yellow, some red, some mixed with blue. This is an incredible find. It's a vital food source, and more importantly, it's seed corn they can plant for the next season. Te Khalidi, a special providence of God. However, this corn belonged to someone. They took it, intending to pay for it later if they ever met the owners. This act, born of desperation, would have complex consequences in their future relationship with the Nazid people, who had stored the corn for their own winter survival. After several days of exhausting exploration, the party returns to the Mayflower, carrying the corn and a story of a difficult but promising land. Their report energizes those on the ship, but the need for a proper settlement site is more urgent than ever. By now, the chaloupe is finally repaired. A second, larger expedition is planned, this time with 24 pilgrims and 9 sailors, led by the master of the Mayflower, Christopher Jones. This time, they would use the shallop to explore the coastline more efficiently. The weather, however, is their greatest enemy. A brutal cold spell hits, and the men, wading from the shallop to the shore in the freezing water, are immediately soaked. Their clothes freeze solid on their bodies, like suits of armor. Bradford vividly describes the misery of that day. Sickness begins to set in, the early signs of the devastating illness that would sweep through the colony that winter. Despite the hardship, they press on exploring deeper into the area now known as During this second trip, they find more abandoned Nazid dwellings and another cache of corn, which they also take. But their most somber discovery is a gravesite. They uncover the remains of what appears to be a man with fine blonde hair, along with tools and other artifacts. This was likely a European sailor or fisherman who had died there years earlier. It is a sobering reminder that they are not the first visitors to this coast, and that death is an ever-present reality here. They respectfully rebury the remains, pondering the fate of the man who came before them. As this second party returns to the ship, the situation aboard the Mayflower is growing more dire. The general sickness is beginning to take hold. People are coughing, fevers are spreading, and the close quarters of the ship are becoming a breeding ground for disease. The need to get off the ship and into proper housing is now a matter of life and death. This leads to the organization of a third and final expedition, the one that would change everything. This third party consists of 10 of their principal men, including Governor Carver, William Bradford, Edward Winslow, and Captain Standish, along with a few sailors. Their goal is to sail the shallop much further down the coast, to a place a previous explorer had mapped and described as a good harbor. The place we now know as Plymouth. The date is December 6th, and the weather is dangerously cold. As they sail along the coast, the sea spray freezes on them instantly. 2 of the men are already so sick they can barely function. It is on this journey that the first truly hostile encounter occurs. One morning, as they are having breakfast near the shore, they are suddenly attacked. A shower of arrows flies out from the woods, accompanied by terrifying war cries. The men scramble for their muskets. Captain Standish, ever the soldier, fires his weapon, and the sharp report of the firearms echoes through the forest. The Nauset warriors, who are rightfully angry about the theft of their corn, are momentarily stunned by the loud noise but continue their assault. The firefight is brief but intense. The Pilgrims manage to drive off their attackers without any casualties on their side. A fortunate outcome they again attribute to God's protection. They name the location the first encounter. Beats. Shaken but resolute, they get back in the shallop and continue their journey. But their ordeal is far from over. A snowstorm descends, and the sea becomes violent. A huge wave crashes over them, breaking their rudder. 2 men struggle to steer the boat with oars. As darkness falls, their mast snaps in 3 pieces, and their sail goes overboard. They are at the mercy of the storm, heading towards a dark shore filled with the terrifying sound of crashing waves. It seems all is lost, but in a moment of sheer luck, or providence, as they saw it, one of the sailors, the ship's mate, yells for them to be of good courage and steer hard. He spots a sheltered cove, and with a final, desperate effort, they manage to guide the battered chaloupe into the lee of a small island, safe from the storm. They had landed on Clark's Island in the middle of Plymouth Harbor. They spend the next day, a Saturday, drying their gear and exploring the island. Then, respecting their faith, they rest on Sunday, the Sabbath. Finally, on Monday, December 11th, 1620, they cross the harbor to the mainland. They step ashore and find exactly what they had been searching for. There are cleared fields, a high hill, perfect for a fort, and, most importantly, several brooks running with fresh, clear water. This is the place. After weeks of searching, enduring freezing temperatures, hunger, sickness, and conflict, they have found their home. They return to the Mayflower with the good news, and soon, the great ship will make its final short voyage across the bay to Plymouth, where the story of the Plymouth colony truly begins. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of the Pilgrims' story. It's a powerful tale of resilience and survival against incredible odds. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through the Pilgrims' story. Last time, we left our weary explorers as they navigated the unfamiliar coastline, searching desperately for a place to call home. Today, in Chapter 11, we witness a pivotal and heart-pounding moment. Their first true encounter with the people of this land. It's a clash born of fear, exhaustion, and a deep chasm of misunderstanding. A moment that would forever shape the future of this fledgling colony. As dawn broke over the icy shores, the air was thick with a palpable sense of unease. The small party of explorers, who had spent a miserable night huddled on the beach, were just beginning to stir. They were far from the Mayflower, low on supplies, and chilled to the bone. The men were divided, some standing guard while others carried their gear and muskets down to the small boat, or shallop, beached on the sand. The plan was to press on, to continue their search for a suitable harbor. They had no idea they were being watched. Suddenly, the pre-dawn quiet was shattered. A strange, piercing cry echoed from the woods. It was a sound they had never heard before, guttural and wild. One of the men near the boat yelled back, thinking it might be a wolf or some other animal. But then, the cry came again, this time from a different direction, and it was answered by others. A dreadful realization washed over them. They were not alone. And this was no animal. An arrow, then another, hissed through the air, thudding into the trees and sand around them. The attack was swift and sudden. From the cover of the woods, a group of Nosit warriors emerged, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. Panic erupted among the explorers. The men who had already laid their muskets in the boat scrambled to retrieve them, fumbling with powder and shot in the dim light. Those still on guard returned fire, the deafening roar of their muskets a stark contrast to the whistle of the arrows. Imagine the chaos on that beach, the salty spray, the biting wind, the cries of the no-sit, and the booming explosions of gunpowder. For the Pilgrims, it was a terrifying confirmation of their deepest fears about this savage new world. They were outnumbered, caught off guard, and fighting for their lives. They saw not men defending their homes, but a fearsome, unprovoked assault. They couldn't understand the Nosite language, their motives, or the history of previous encounters with European sailors that had left a legacy of mistrust and violence. On the other side, for the Nosit people, this was a moment of defense. They saw a group of armed strangers encroaching on their ancestral land. Who were these pale-faced men with their loud fire sticks? What were their intentions? Just a few years earlier, an English captain had kidnapped several Noset men, leaving a scar of betrayal on the community. For them, this was not an act of aggression, but a necessary stand to protect their families and their territory from a potential threat. They were fighting to preserve their way of life against an unknown and unpredictable force. The skirmish itself was brief, but brutal. The explorers, having finally organized themselves, unleashed a coordinated volley of musket fire. The sheer noise and power of the firearms, something the Nosite had likely never experienced on this scale, seemed to have a decisive effect. One particularly bold Nosit leader stood his ground behind a tree, skillfully dodging shots and loosing arrows. An explorer took careful aim, his shot splintering the tree right beside the warrior. That near me seemed to be the turning point. With a final great shout, the Nosit warriors faded back into the woods as quickly as they had appeared. Silence fell once more upon the beach, broken only by the lapping waves and the heavy breathing of the shaken explorers. They cautiously checked their ranks. Miraculously, not a single one of them had been hit. They found a number of arrows stuck in their coats and scattered on the ground, a chilling testament to how close they had come to disaster. They gathered the arrows, marveling at their craftsmanship tipped with bone, brass, and eagle claws. Shaken but resolute, they gave thanks for their deliverance. They named the location the First Encounter Beach in their records, a name that endures to this day. They boarded their shallop, hoisted the sail, and pushed off into the rough seas, leaving the shore behind. But the memory of the encounter, the fear, and the adrenaline was seared into their minds. It reinforced their perception of the natives as hostile and dangerous, deepening the divide between the two cultures before a single word of peaceful dialogue could be exchanged. This short, violent clash on a cold December morning was more than just a fight. It was a profound and tragic misunderstanding. It was the collision of two worlds, each acting out of fear and a desire for self-preservation. The explorers, isolated and vulnerable, saw only a savage attack. The Nosit, defending their homeland from suspicious intruders, saw only a necessary show of force. Neither side could comprehend the other's perspective, their history, or their humanity. This event highlights the immense challenges they faced. It wasn't just about surviving the winter or finding food. It was about navigating a complex human landscape they were utterly unprepared for. The first encounter set a tense precedent for future interactions and serves as a powerful reminder of how easily fear and miscommunication can lead to conflict. As we will say, this was not the end of their interactions with the native peoples, but a very difficult beginning. The path to coexistence, let alone friendship, would be long and fraught with peril. Thank you so much for joining me for this intense chapter of the Pilgrims' story. The events on this beach were a critical turning point, and their echoes will be felt throughout the rest of our series. If you found this account compelling, please give this video a like, and consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss what happens next. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore this incredible history. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we've arrived at Chapter 12, a pivotal moment in American history. The landing at Plymouth Rock. Imagine the scene. It's late 1620. Over 100 souls have spent more than 2 grueling months at sea, tossed about by the relentless Atlantic. Their ship, the Mayflower, was cramped. The conditions were harsh, and the future was utterly uncertain. They were driven by a powerful desire for religious freedom, a dream that pushed them across an ocean to a world they had only heard about in stories. As the Mayflower finally dropped anchor in the cold waters of what is now Plymouth Harbor, the sight of land must have been overwhelming. This wasn't the lush, welcoming shore they might have envisioned. It was the coast of New England in early winter, stark, windswept, and intimidating. But for these weary travelers, it was something more. It was the edge of a new world, a canvas on which they hoped to paint a new life. They had originally aimed for the Hudson River, further south, but storms had blown them off course, leading them to this rugged, uncharted territory. Before anyone even set foot on shore, they did something remarkable. They drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a revolutionary act. It was a social contract, an agreement to form a civil body politic and enact just and equal laws for the good of the colony. In that moment, aboard a small ship in a desolate harbor, they laid a cornerstone for self-governance and democratic ideals that would echo for centuries. It was a promise they made to each other, to stick together and build a community from scratch, bound by law and mutual consent. Now, let's talk about the rock itself, Plymouth Rock. Over time, this simple glacial erratic has become a powerful national symbol. Is it the exact, literal spot where the first Pilgrims stepped ashore? Historians have debated this for centuries. The first recorded claim linking the Pilgrims to this specific rock came more than 120 years after the landing, from a 94-year-old man named Thomas Font, who had heard the story from his father, who in turn had heard it from the original settlers. While its pinpoint historical accuracy might be fuzzy, its symbolic power is undeniable. Plymouth Rock represents more than just a landing spot. It embodies the very idea of arrival, of a new beginning against all odds. It's the physical marker of a threshold crossed, from the old world to the new, from persecution to the pursuit of freedom, from a life dictated by others to a life of their own making. Standing on that shore, they faced a hideous and desolate wilderness, as their leader William Bradford would later write. The challenges were immense. A harsh winter was setting in. They had no shelter, and supplies were dwindling. The first winter was brutal, a period known as the starving time. Disease and malnutrition swept through the small settlement. By the spring of 1621, nearly half of the original passengers and crew of the Mayflower would be gone. It's a heartbreaking and crucial part of their story. They buried their dead at night on Coles Hill, leveling the graves so that the native peoples would know how weakened and diminished their numbers had become. It was a testament to their sheer desperation and their unwavering resolve to survive. But they were not entirely alone. The story of Plymouth cannot be told without acknowledging the Wampanoag people, who had lived on this land for thousands of years. In the spring, a momentous encounter took place. An Abenaki man named Samoset walked boldly into their settlement and greeted them in broken English, which he had learned from fishermen. He later returned with Tisquanum, or Squanto, a member of the Patuxet tribe. Squanto's story is incredible in its own right. He had been kidnapped years earlier, taken to Europe, and had only recently returned to find his entire village wiped out by disease. Squanto became an indispensable guide and interpreter for the Pilgrims. He taught them how to cultivate corn, a crop they had never seen before. He showed them where to fish and how to tap maple trees for sap. He helped them navigate the complex relationships with other Native American tribes, ultimately facilitating a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag leader, Masis. This alliance was critical for the survival of the fledgling colony. It was a rare and fragile moment of cooperation, born out of mutual need. Thanks to this help and their own relentless labor, the Pilgrims' fortunes began to turn. They built homes, planted fields, and slowly, a village began to take shape. By the autumn of 1621, they had gathered a modest but successful harvest to celebrate their survival and give thanks for their blessings. Governor William Bradford declared a feast and invited their Wampanoag allies. Massasoit arrived with about 90 of his men, and for 3 days, they feasted together on deer, fowl, fish, and the fruits of the harvest. This event, of course, is what we now remember as the first Thanksgiving. It was a moment of shared humanity and gratitude, a bright spot after a year of profound hardship and loss. The landing at Plymouth Rock, therefore, is not just a single event, but the beginning of a complex and multifaceted story. It's a story of courage, faith, and incredible endurance. It's a story of the birth of a community founded on the radical idea of self. It's also a story of cultural encounter, of cooperation, and, as history would later show, of conflict. The arrival of these English settlers marked a profound and permanent change for the land and its original inhabitants. As we look back at that cold December day, at that symbolic step onto a lonely rock, we see the start of a chapter that would define the character of a nation. It's a story filled with hope, tragedy, and the unyielding human spirit to build a home and a better future, no matter the cost. The legacy of Plymouth is woven into the fabric of America, reminding us of the difficult beginnings and the enduring ideals that continue to shape our world today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the story of Plymouth Rock. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please give this video a thumbs up. And do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure into the past. See you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. When we last left the Pilgrims, they had finally found a place to call home, a place they named Plymouth. But a patch of land, no matter how promising, is not home. Now, in the biting cold of a New England winter, their most daunting task began: building a settlement from the ground up. This is Chapter 13. Building a Settlement. Imagine this. It's December 1620. The Mayflower is anchored in the harbor. It's cold. Damp confines still the only shelter for most of the families. Every morning, the able-bodied men would row to shore, their hands raw from the cold, their breath turning to mist in the frigid air. Their mission: to filtre so timber, and begin the back-breaking work of constructing the first houses of Plymouth Colony. The landscape they faced was a formidable one. Dense forests of oak, pine, and birch stood as silent witnesses to their struggle. These weren't the manicured woods of England. They were a wild, untamed wilderness, armed with simple tools, axes, saws, and adzes. The men set to work. The rhythmic thud of axes against wood echoed through the frosty air, a sound of both desperation and determination. Each swing was a fight against the cold, against hunger, and against the crushing exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm them. Their plan was ambitious, born of a need for order and defense. They laid out a simple street plan with two main intersecting thoroughfares. At the top of the hill overlooking the settlement, they designated a spot for their most important structure, a common house, which would serve as a meeting hall, a church, and a fort all in one. This building was the heart of their new community, a symbol of their unity and their faith. For now, it was just a plot of land, but in their minds, it was already a bastion against the wilderness. The first houses were humble affairs, a far cry from the sturdy stone cottages they had left behind in Europe. They used a technique called wattle and daub. First, they drove wooden posts into the ground to create a frame. Then, they wove flexible branches and reeds the wattle between the posts to create a lattice-like wall. Finally, they plastered this framework with a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. This method was relatively quick, but the resulting homes were drafty and offered minimal protection against the relentless New England winter. The roofs were thatched with dried grasses and reeds gathered from the nearby marshes. While effective at shedding rain and snow, these thatched roofs were also a constant fire hazard, a danger that weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Inside, a single room would house an entire family. A crude fireplace at one end provided warmth and a place to cook, but it also filled the small space with smoke. The floors were simple packed earth, cold and damp. These were not homes of comfort, they were shelters of survival. While the men toiled on shore, the women and children remained on the Mayflower. Their life was no less difficult. The ship, which had been their vessel of hope, had become a floating prison of sickness and sorrow. The cramped, unsanitary conditions were a breeding ground for disease, scurvy, pneumonia, and consumption. what we now call tuberculosis, ran rampant. The general sickness, as they called it, began to claim lives at an alarming rate. Every day, the survivors on the ship would watch the shore, praying for the sight of a finished roof, a sign of progress, a glimmer of hope that they might soon escape the misery of the Mayflower. But progress was agonizingly slow. The brutal weather was their constant enemy. Vicious winter storms, known as nor'easters, would sweep in from the Atlantic, dumping feet of snow and bringing gale-force winds. On these days, all work would cease. The men would be forced to huddle for shelter on shore or row back to the ship, defeated for the day. Even on clear days, the cold was a physical adversary. Tools would freeze to their hands, and the frozen ground resisted their every attempt to dig foundations. Many of the men, already weakened by the long voyage and poor nutrition, fell ill themselves. Governor John Carver and military leader Miles Standish worked tirelessly, trying to organize the labor and keep morale from collapsing. They led by example, working alongside the others, sharing in the hardship and the suffering. By January, the situation was dire. Of the roughly 100 passengers who had arrived, nearly half were now sick. The common house, the first building they managed to complete, was immediately turned into a hospital. It was a scene of immense suffering. The sick lay on rough-hewn beds, their coughs and groans filling the smoke-filled air. The few healthy individuals, like William Brewster and Miles Standish, worked ceaselessly, tending to the sick, fetching water, and trying to provide what little comfort they could. Despite the death and despair, the work continued. They were driven by a powerful force, the knowledge that there was no turning back. The Mayflower would eventually sail back to England, with or without them. This new land was their only option. Their survival, and the survival of their dream of a new society, depended on their ability to endure this first, terrible winter. Every log they hoisted into place, every nail they drove, was an act of faith and a defiance against the odds. As the weeks dragged on, the settlement began to take shape, slowly and painfully. A few small houses now stood along the main street. Smoke curled from their chimneys, a fragile sign of life in the vast, frozen wilderness. But the cost was staggering. At the peak of the sickness, 2 or 3 people were dying each day. They were buried at night in unmarked graves on Coles Hill, their deaths kept secret from the native peoples who might be watching from the forest, lest they see how weakened the colony had become. The Pilgrims' faith was tested to its absolute limit. They had come to this new world seeking religious freedom, to build a community based on their beliefs. But now, they were faced with the very real possibility that their city upon a hill would be nothing more than a graveyard. Yet, they did not abandon their faith. They gathered for prayers in the cold, their voices weak, but their spirits unbroken. They found strength in their shared purpose and in their belief that God had a plan for them, even amidst the suffering. This period, known as the Starving Time, forged the character of Plymouth Colony. It was a crucible of hardship that stripped away everything but the essential will to live. Those who survived would carry the memory of that first winter for the rest of their lives. It was a brutal lesson in the realities of the new world. A world that was both beautiful and deadly, promising and unforgiving. As winter finally began to loosen its icy grip, the Pilgrims stood on the precipice, their numbers decimated, but their resolve hardened. They had built a settlement, but the question remained: could they hold on to it? Thank you for joining us for this chapter of the Pilgrims' story. It is a powerful reminder of the incredible resilience and fortitude of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you next time as we explore the Pilgrims' first encounters with the native people who had been watching them all along. Hello, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're delving into a chapter of profound hardship and resilience, a period that would test the very limits of human endurance. We're talking about the terrible winter that befell the early colonists, a season of brutal cold, gnawing hunger, and relentless illness that would forever be etched in their history. As the first snowflakes began to fall, they signaled not the cozy charm of winter, but the arrival of a formidable adversary. The colonists, ill-prepared for the severity of the climate, found themselves in a desperate struggle against the elements. The autumn harvest had been meager, a disappointing yield that now looked terrifyingly small as the days grew shorter and colder. The colonists had built simple, drafty shelters, offering little protection against the biting winds and plummeting temperatures. The cold was a constant, creeping thief, stealing warmth from their bodies and morale from their hearts. They huddled together, sharing what little body heat they could generate, their breath misting in the frigid air of their own homes. Firewood, their primary source of warmth, became as precious as food. Each day, able-bodied men would venture into the snow-covered woods, their energy sapped by the cold and their meager rations, to chop and haul back the fuel needed to keep the fires burning, to keep the fragile flame of their small community alive. But the cold was just one of the specters haunting them. Hunger soon became an ever-present torment. The initial stores of grain and salted meat dwindled at an alarming rate. The colonists were forced to ration their food with painstaking precision, each portion a grim reminder of their dwindling supplies. The children's hungry cries were a constant, heart-wrenching soundtrack to their daily existence. Hunting parties ventured out, but the deep snow and harsh weather made finding game nearly impossible. The familiar forests, once a source of abundance, had become a barren, frozen wasteland. They resorted to eating anything they could find: acorns, roots, and even boiling leather from their own shoes and belts, just to have something warm in their stomachs. The hunger was more than a physical pain. It was a psychological weight, eroding their hope and breeding desperation within the cramped, cold walls of their settlement. As their bodies weakened from the cold and malnutrition, the colonists became tragically vulnerable to disease. Sickness began to spread through the settlement like wildfire. Coughs and fevers, which might have been minor ailments in better times, quickly developed into life-threatening conditions. With no proper medicine and limited knowledge of effective treatments, they could do little more than offer comfort and pray. The small settlement was transformed into a large, makeshift infirmary. But the caregivers were often as sick as the patients they were trying to help. The constant presence of illness and the daily toll it took created an atmosphere of pervasive gloom and fear. Every morning brought the dreadful question of who hadn't survived the night. The social fabric of the colony, woven from shared dreams and mutual reliance, began to fray under the immense strain. Tempers grew short. Old friendships were tested. The struggle for survival became an individual one. Yet they knew, deep down, that their only hope lay in sticking together. Leaders emerged, not by title, but by the strength of their character and their unwavering resolve. They rallied the spirits of the weary, organized the remaining able-bodied for essential tasks, and ensured that the weakest were cared for as best as possible. They shared stories of their homeland, sang hymns to bolster their faith, and reminded each other of the purpose that had brought them to this unforgiving new world. These small acts of humanity and community were the flickering candles that pushed back against the overwhelming darkness. The winters seemed endless, a relentless cycle of gray days and freezing nights. The death toll climbed steadily. One by one, friends, family members, and neighbors succumbed to the harsh realities of their situation. Each loss was a devastating blow, a fresh wound on the collective soul of the colony. They would hold simple, somber burials in the frozen ground, the survivors too weak and heartbroken for elaborate ceremony. By the time the first signs of spring began to whisper through the trees, the settlement was a shadow of its former self, of the original group of vibrant and hopeful colonists who had arrived months earlier. Only a small, resilient handful remained. Half of their number had been lost to the terrible winter. As the snow finally began to melt, revealing the dormant earth beneath, it was a bittersweet sight for the survivors. The warmth of the sun on their faces was a long-forgotten comfort, but it couldn't erase the memory of the loved ones they had lost. The green shoots pushing through the soil were symbols of new life, but also reminders of the immense cost of their survival. They were gaunt, weary, and grieving, but they were alive. They had faced the absolute worst, a trial by ice and starvation, and they had endured. This terrible winter had forged them in a crucible of suffering, stripping them down to their very core but leaving behind an unbreakable spirit. They were no longer just colonists. They were survivors, bound together by a shared trauma and a fierce determination to build the future that so many had died trying to reach. Their story stands as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Thank you so much for joining us for for this poignant chapter. It's a humbling reminder of the sacrifices made by those who came before. If you found this story moving, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the history of the Pilgrims. Today, we're re-diving into one of the most astonishing and pivotal moments of their first year in the New World. Imagine this. After a brutal winter that has decimated their numbers, the survivors in Plymouth are isolated, wary, and struggling just to stay alive. They've had a few tense, distant encounters with the native population, but no real communication. They are, for all intents and purposes, utterly alone on a vast, unfamiliar continent. It's mid-March, 1621. The weather is finally starting to turn. The snow is melting. The air is a bit warmer. And for the first time in months, a glimmer of hope for spring is on the horizon. The Pilgrims are trying to establish some sense of normalcy. They're holding a military meeting, organizing their small militia under Captain Miles Standish, planning their defenses, and figuring out how to plant crops for the coming season. The mood is probably a mix of grim determination and cautious optimism. Then, the unthinkable happens. A man appears, walking confidently and directly towards their fledgling settlement. This isn't unusual in itself. They'd seen native people from a distance. But this man is different. He's tall, strong, with long black hair. He carries a bow and 2 arrows, one headed and one unheaded, a sign of peaceful intentions. But that's not what leaves every single pilgrim frozen in stunned silence. As he strolls into the middle of their settlement, he raises his hand and, in a clear, bold voice, speaks a language they never expected to hear. He says, "Welcome, Englishmen." Can you even fathom the shock? They are thousands of miles from home, in what they consider the absolute wilderness, and a native man has just greeted them in their own language. Not just broken phrases, but a clear, understandable greeting. It would have been like seeing an alien step out of a spaceship and ask for a cup of tea. The Pilgrims are completely dumbfounded. Where did he learn English? Who is he? Is this a trap? Their minds must have been racing with a million questions. This man's name was Somerset. He wasn't from the local Wampanoag tribe, but was a sagamore, or a subordinate chief, of the Abenaki people from modern-day Maine. His presence in Plymouth was a sheer coincidence. He had been visiting the Wampanoag chief, Massis. So, how did he know English? Somerset, it turns out, had learned it from English fishermen and traders who had been frequenting the coast of Maine for years. This contact, which the Pilgrims knew nothing about, had been happening long before they ever arrived. Somerset wasn't just a linguistic curiosity. He was a walking, talking encyclopedia of the region. He was friendly, confident, and incredibly curious about the newcomers. The Pilgrims, overcoming their initial shock, cautiously welcomed him. They offered him food and drink biscuits, butter, cheese, pudding, and a piece of mallard duck. He eagerly accepted, showing a particular liking for their beer. This initial sharing of food was a crucial, humanizing moment. It was the first real, peaceful interaction between the two cultures. Somerset stayed with them that night. He talked for hours, and the Pilgrims listened intently, hanging on his every word. He began to paint a picture of the world they had landed in. He told them about the different tribes in the area, their leaders, their numbers, and their territories. He gave them the lay of the land, something they desperately needed. More importantly, he told them about the very ground they were standing on. The village of Patuxet, where the Pilgrims had built their settlement, had a tragic and recent history. Somerset explained that just 4 years earlier, it had been a thriving community, but a terrible plague, likely brought by European traders, had swept through the coastal region and wiped out the entire population of Patuxet. This is why the Pilgrims had found cleared fields, a convenient water source, and no one to contest their landing. They were, quite literally, living in a ghost town. This revelation was both a shock and a sobering explanation for their strange, uncontested arrival. Somerset's visit did more than just provide information. It broke the ice. It transformed the mysterious, silent landscape into a place with a history, a map, and living people. He was the bridge they never knew they needed. He explained that the local tribe, the Wampanoag, led by their great Massasoit, were wary of the English. Previous encounters with other Europeans had involved violence and kidnapping, so that caution was welcome. But Samoset's friendly demeanor and the information he shared began to ease these tensions. He wasn't just a messenger, he was a diplomat. He promised the Pilgrims that he would return, and he would bring others with him who could trade. He also mentioned someone else, a man named Tisquanem, or Squanto, who had lived in England and spoke even better English than he did. This was a tantalizing piece of information, a promise of an even deeper connection to this new world. When Samoset left the next morning, the Pilgrims gave him a knife, a bracelet, and a ring as gifts. It was a small gesture, but it cemented a new relationship built on mutual curiosity rather than fear. His unexpected visit was the crack of dawn after their long, dark winter. It was the moment that turned their story from one of mere survival into one of interaction, diplomacy, and ultimately, alliance. Without Samoset walking out of the woods that day, the story of Plymouth Colony, and perhaps even the story of America, could have been vastly different. He wasn't just an unexpected visitor. He was the key that unlocked their future. Thank you so much for watching and joining us on this incredible historical journey. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter, where we'll meet the legendary Squanto. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're re-diving into one of the most remarkable and pivotal stories in early American history. The story of Squanto and his incredible friendship with the struggling Pilgrim settlers. It's a tale that truly feels like it was written for a movie, filled with unbelievable twists of fate, immense hardship, and ultimately, the power of human connection. Imagine this. It is the spring of 1621. The Pilgrims have just endured a brutal first winter at Plymouth. Nearly half of their original group has perished from disease, starvation, and the harsh New England cold. They are weak, grieving, and completely unprepared for the challenges of this new world. They tried planting the seeds they brought from England, but the soil was different, and their crops failed. Despair was setting in. It seemed their dream of a new life was destined to end in tragedy. Then, one day in March, a tall Native American man walked confidently into their settlement and greeted them in English. This was Samoset, an Abenaki Sachem. The Pilgrims were stunned. How could this man speak their language? Samoset explained he had learned it from English fishermen who had been visiting the coast for years. After spending the night and sharing information, he promised to return with someone who spoke even better English. A few days later, he came back, and with him was the man who would change everything for the Pilgrims. Tisquanam, or as we know him, Squanto's life story before meeting the Pilgrims is nothing short of extraordinary and, frankly, heartbreaking. He was a member of the Patuxet tribe, which had lived on the very land where the Pilgrims built their Plymouth settlement. Around 1614, years before the Mayflower arrived, Squanto was captured by an English explorer, Thomas Hunt, who took him and several other Native Americans to Spain to be sold into slavery. Think about that for a moment. Forcibly taken from your home, across a vast ocean, to a foreign land. But fate had other plans for Squanto. He was rescued by a group of local friars, who introduced him to Christianity and helped him make his way to London. In England, he lived with a merchant named John Slaney and worked as an interpreter and a guide. Further perfecting his English, he desperately wanted to return home, and after several years, he finally managed to get passage on a ship heading back to New England. However, the home he returned to was gone. While he was away, a devastating plague, likely brought by European traders, had swept through the coastal tribes. His entire village, the Patuxet people, had been wiped out. Everyone he knew and loved, his family, his friends, was gone. He was the last of his tribe. Imagine the profound grief and loneliness he must have felt, standing on the same ground where his home once stood, now utterly alone. It is out of this immense personal tragedy that one of history's most important friendships was born. When Squanto arrived at the struggling Plymouth colony, he found a group of strangers living on the ghosts of his past. He could have been filled with hatred and resentment. He had every reason to see these English settlers as part of the world that had taken everything from him, but he didn't. Instead, he chose a path of compassion and cooperation. Governor William Bradford wrote in his journal that Squanto became their special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. This wasn't an exaggeration. Squanto's knowledge was the key to the Pilgrims' survival. He saw their feeble attempts at farming and understood their methods wouldn't work in the local soil. So, he taught them the Native American way to plant corn, which would become their most important crop. This wasn't just about digging a hole and dropping in a seed. He showed them the Three Sisters method, an ingenious agricultural practice where corn, beans, and squash are planted together. The corn provides a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans enrich the soil with nitrogen, and the broad leaves of the squash shade the ground, preventing weeds and keeping the soil moist. He also taught them a crucial fertilization technique, using local fish, like alewives or herring, in the soil. He showed them how to place a fish in the mound of earth with the seeds, providing essential nutrients that the New England soil lacked. This knowledge was a game-changer. Without Squanto, the Pilgrims' harvest would have likely failed again, and the colony would have starved. But his guidance didn't stop with farming. He taught them where and how to fish for cod and eels in the local rivers and streams. He showed them which native plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. He guided them through the forests, teaching them how to tap maple trees for sap and how to hunt for deer and turkey. Essentially, Squanto became their teacher, their guide, and their interpreter to the natural world of North America. Beyond just survival skills, Squanto played a critical role as a diplomat. He was the bridge between the Pilgrims and the surrounding Wampanoag people, led by their powerful chief Massasoit. Having an interpreter who understood both cultures was invaluable. Squanto facilitated the meeting between Governor Carver and Massasoit, which led to a historic peace treaty. This treaty, a pact of mutual defense and non-aggression, lasted for over 50 years, and was absolutely essential for the colony's security. Without this peace, the small, vulnerable group of Pilgrims could have easily been wiped out by the far more numerous and powerful native tribes. Squanto lived with the Pilgrims for the rest of his life, becoming an integral part of their community. He wasn't just an occasional visitor. He was a resident, a friend, and a counselor. When a Pilgrim child got lost in the woods, it was Squanto who helped organize the search party with the Wampanoag. His presence was a constant source of stability and knowledge. In the fall of 1621, thanks to Squanto's guidance, the Pilgrims reaped a bountiful harvest. They had corn, beans, squash, and plenty of preserved fish and game. They were no longer starving. They were secure. To celebrate this success and to give thanks for their survival, they held a harvest feast. And who did they invite as their guests of honor? Chief Massasoit, and about 90% of his Wampanoag men. Squanto was there, of course, translating and celebrating alongside the people he had saved. This event, this shared meal of gratitude, is what we now remember as the first Thanksgiving. It was a moment made possible by one man's incredible choice to help, rather than hate. Tragically, Squanto's life was cut short. In the fall of 1622, while acting as a guide and interpreter for Governor Bradford on a trading expedition around Cape Cod, he suddenly fell ill with a fever, what the Pilgrims called an Indian fever. Within a few days, he was gone. On his deathbed, he asked Governor Bradford to pray for him, that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven, and he generously bequeathed his few possessions to his English friends. Governor Bradford mourned him deeply, writing that the Pilgrims had lost their interpreter and special friend. They recognized that his death was a great loss, not just for his practical skills, but for the genuine bond they had formed. The story of Squanto is a powerful reminder that history is made by individuals and their choices. Faced with unimaginable loss, he chose to extend a hand of friendship to strangers. His knowledge, his diplomacy, and his compassion were the cornerstones upon which the Plymouth colony was built. Without him, it is almost certain the Pilgrims would not have survived, and the story of America would be very different. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this incredible chapter of our shared history. I hope it gives you a new perspective on the familiar story of the Pilgrims. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't want to miss our next journey into the past. Drop a comment below, and let me know what you think about Squanto's amazing life. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through the Pilgrim saga. When we last left our weary settlers, they had just endured a brutal first winter, losing nearly half their number. Their future in this new world was anything but certain, hanging by the thinnest of threads. They were weak, grieving, and desperately in need of a miracle. That miracle was about to walk right into their village. Imagine the scene. A lone figure emerges from the forest, not with a weapon raised, but with a hand extended in greeting. This was Samoset, an Abenaki leader who had learned some English from fishermen. He stunned the pilgrims by welcoming them in their own language. Samoset was the opening act, the scout for an even more significant encounter. A few days later, he returned, but this time, he wasn't alone. With him was Tisquanum, or Squanto, whose story is so incredible it deserves its own chapter. Squanto, a member of the Patuxet tribe, had been kidnapped, taken to Europe, and had only recently returned to find his entire village wiped out by disease. His linguistic skills and deep understanding of both European and native cultures made him the perfect bridge between two worlds. But the most important figure to arrive was the great Sachem, the chief of the Wampanoag people. Masusia. He didn't come alone. He was accompanied by a retinue of 60 warriors. You can feel the tension in the air. The Pilgrims, led by Governor John Carver, were vastly outnumbered and physically weak. Was this a war party? A scouting mission? Or something else entirely? With Squanto acting as the indispensable interpreter, a historic negotiation began. Both sides had something the other needed. The Pilgrims needed allies, food, and knowledge to survive. Massasoit, whose Wampanoag confederation had also been devastated by European diseases and was facing threats from rival tribes, like the Nerg, needed military strength and a powerful alliance. What followed was one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements in early American history. Governor Carver and Chief Massasoit hammered out a treaty of mutual peace and protection. This wasn't just a casual agreement. It was a formal alliance with 6 key points. First, neither party would injure or harm the other. Second, if any did, the offender would be sent to the other for punishment. Third, if anything was stolen, it would be returned. Fourth, and this is crucial, if either side was attacked by an enemy, the other would come to their aid. This was a true military alliance. Fifth, they would send their allies word of this peace agreement to ensure they were included. And finally, when they met, they would leave their weapons behind as a sign of peace. To seal the deal, Governor Carver and Massasoit shared a drink and a meal. It was a moment of profound hope. This treaty wasn't just about preventing conflict. It was about building a future together. It created a zone of peace and cooperation that would last for over 50 years, an astonishingly long time in that volatile era. The Pilgrims now had powerful friends who could teach them how to plant corn where it's a fees, and how to navigate the unfamiliar landscape. The Wampanoag had a well-armed partner to help secure their position in the region. The immediate effects were transformative. With the fear of attack lessened and the promise of a good harvest, thanks to Wampanoag guidance, the spirit in Plymouth plantation lifted. Squanto became a permanent resident of the settlement, acting not just as an interpreter but as a teacher, a guide, and a diplomat. He showed them how to plant corn the native way, using fish as fertilizer, a technique that would ensure their survival. He guided them through the complex web of intertribal politics, helping them understand the world they had just entered. This alliance was the foundation upon which the colony would be built. Without Massasoit's friendship and the Wampanoag's help, it is almost certain that the Plymouth colony would have failed, joining the long list of lost settlements in the New World. It was a partnership born of mutual need but sustained by a degree of mutual respect. It allowed the Pilgrims to not only survive, but to eventually thrive. This peace treaty represents a powerful what-if in American history. It was a moment where two vastly different cultures chose diplomacy over conflict, cooperation over conquest. It demonstrates that peaceful coexistence was not just a possibility, but for a time, a reality. The image of the Pilgrim governor and the Wampanoag chief sharing a meal is a potent symbol of this fragile but vital peace. The alliance with Massasoit secured the Pilgrims' immediate future and set the stage for one of the most famous events in American folklore. The first Thanksgiving. That harvest festival, a celebration of survival and partnership, would have been unthinkable without the treaty forged in the spring of 1621. We'll explore that iconic feast and the deepening relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag in our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. It's these incredible human moments that truly bring the past to life. If you're enjoying this series, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a pivotal moment, a turning point filled with relief and gratitude. Chapter 18, A True Harvest of Hope. If you've been following along, you know the immense hardships the Pilgrims faced during that first brutal winter. The specter of starvation was a constant, unwelcome guest. But as the seasons turned, so did their fortunes, thanks in large part to an unexpected friend. As the late summer sun warmed the fields of New Plymouth, a sight for sore eyes began to emerge. The corn, which had once been just a handful of foreign seeds, now stood tall and proud, its ears heavy and ready. This wasn't just any crop. It was a symbol of survival, a testament to the knowledge shared by their Wampanoag guide, Squanto. Remember him? The man who taught them not just what to plant, but how to plant it in this unfamiliar soil. He showed them the ancient technique of using fish as fertilizer, a secret that made all the difference. Without his guidance, these fields might have remained barren. Imagine the scene. Men, women, and even children moving through the rows of corn, their hands finally touching the fruits of their labor. The backbreaking work of clearing the land, tilling the soil, and anxiously tending the sprouts was finally paying off. Each stalk they cut, each ear of corn they gathered, was more than just food. It was a promise. It was the promise of a full belly through the coming winter, the promise of security, and the promise that their tremendous gamble in crossing the ocean might not have been in vain. Alongside the corn, other crops flourished. The barley, though not as successful as they had hoped, still yielded a modest supply. But it was the native plants that truly thrived. Squashes and pumpkins, vibrant orange and green, dotted the fields. These were vegetables the Pilgrims had never seen before, but they quickly learned to appreciate their versatility and nutritional value. The gardens near their simple homes were also bursting with beans and other greens, adding much-needed variety to their diet. The forest, which had once seemed so menacing, was now a source of bounty. Guided by the Wampanoag, the Pilgrims learned which berries were safe to eat, which nuts to gather, and how to track game more effectively. The rivers in the bay, once just a vast expanse of water, were now understood as a rich larder. They had learned the best times and places to fish for cod and bass, and how to dig for clams and mussels along the shore. The fear of the unknown was slowly being replaced by a confident understanding of their environment. Governor William Bradford, a man who had chronicled every tragedy and setback with a heavy heart, could now write with a sense of profound relief. He saw the storehouses beginning to fill and knew that his people would not face the same horrifying starvation that had decimated their numbers the previous year. This harvest wasn't just about physical sustenance. It was about nourishing the soul of the colony. It rebuilt morale, strengthened their resolve, and gave them a tangible reason to believe in their future. Think about the psychological shift. For months, every day was a struggle for basic survival. Now, for the first time, they could look ahead with a sense of security. They could plan for the future, not just endure the present. This newfound stability allowed them to focus on other things, strengthening their homes, reinforcing their small fort, and building a more organized community. The constant gnawing anxiety began to subside, replaced by a quiet, collective sigh of relief. This success was a shared one. It was a powerful example of two vastly different cultures coming together, not in conflict, but in cooperation. Ese cuanto. His willingness to share his knowledge was the bridge that connected the Pilgrims' desperate need with the land's abundance. He wasn't just an interpreter or a guide. He was a teacher, a diplomat, and the key to their survival. His role in this story cannot be overstated. He helped them understand that this new world wasn't something to be conquered, but something to live in harmony with. As the harvest was brought in and the final stocks were put away, a powerful feeling of gratitude swept through the small community. They had faced the absolute worst and had come through to the other side. They looked at their full storehouses, at the healthy faces of their children, and at the peaceful relationship they had forged with their Wampanoag neighbors. It was clear that this moment deserved to be marked, to be celebrated. They had been given a second chance, and this harvest was the proof. This feeling of overwhelming thankfulness would soon lead to one of the most iconic events in American history, a feast of celebration that we'll explore in our next chapter. The harvest of 1621 was more than just a collection of crops. It was a harvest of hope. It was the moment the Plymouth colony truly put down roots, not just in the soil, but in the belief that they could build a new life in this new land. It was the dawn after a very long and dark night. Thank you so much for joining me on this part of the story. It's a powerful reminder that even in the most difficult times, help can come from unexpected places, and hard work can truly pay off. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happens next, please hit that like button and make sure you're resubscribed so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're diving into a story many of us think we know, a cornerstone of American tradition. The first Thanksgiving, but what really happened back in 1621. Let's journey back in time, beyond the simple storybook pictures, to uncover the true spirit and complexity of that historic feast. The year is 1620. A small, battered ship called the Mayflower, carrying about 102 passengers, crosses the vast Atlantic Ocean. These weren't adventurers seeking gold. They were families, men, women, and children, known to history as the Pilgrims. They were separatists, seeking a new land where they could practice their faith freely, far from the Church of England. After a grueling 66-day voyage, they landed not in their intended destination of Virginia, but on the shores of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in the cold of November. The world they found was harsh, unfamiliar, and unforgiving. Their first winter was devastating. Housed in a fledgling settlement they named Plymouth, the colonists faced bitter cold, rampant disease, and starvation. They were unprepared for the brutal New England winter. By the time spring arrived in 1621, nearly half of the original Mayflower passengers had perished. The dream of a new life was hanging by a thread, and their survival was anything but certain. Imagine the despair, huddled together in simple wooden huts, listening to the winter wind howl, wondering if you would be the next to fall ill. It was a time of immense hardship and profound loss. But with the spring came a glimmer of hope, and it arrived in the most unexpected way. In March 1621, a Native American man named Somerset, from the Abenaki tribe, walked boldly into the Plymouth settlement and greeted the startled colonists in broken English, which he had learned from English fishermen. It was a shocking moment for the Pilgrims. Somerset later returned with another man, whose name would become legendary in this story, Tisquantum, or as he is more famously known, Squanto. Squanto's life story is incredible. He was a member of the Patuxet tribe, which had once lived on the very land where the Pilgrims now struggled. Years earlier, he had been captured by an English sea captain and taken to Europe, where he learned English before finally making his way back to his homeland. But upon his return, he found a tragedy. His entire tribe had been wiped out by a plague, likely brought by earlier European visitors. He was the last of the Patuxet. Despite this personal tragedy, Squanto chose to help the struggling English colonists. He became their interpreter, their guide, and most importantly, their teacher. He taught them how to cultivate the native corn, showing them the crucial technique of fertilizing the soil with fish. He taught them which other local plants were safe to eat, where to fish in the rivers, and how to tap maple trees for sap. Squanto was more than just a helper. He was their lifeline. Without his knowledge of the land, it's almost certain that the remaining Pilgrims would not have survived another year. He also helped forge a critical alliance between the Pilgrims and the local Wampanoag tribe, led by their Satum, or Chief Messiah. This alliance was mutually beneficial, providing the Pilgrims with security and the Wampanoag with an ally against rival tribes. Throughout the spring and summer of 1621, the Pilgrims, guided by Squanto, worked tirelessly. They planted their crops, built more substantial homes, and slowly began to establish a foothold in this new world. The sun shone, the rains came, and their fields of corn, beans, and pumpkins grew strong. As autumn approached, they were met with a sight that must have filled their hearts with overwhelming relief and gratitude. A bountiful harvest. They had done it. They had survived. Governor William Bradford, the leader of the colony, decided to call for a special celebration to give thanks for their survival and their successful harvest. This wasn't just a religious observance. It was a community-wide expression of profound gratitude. They had faced death and despair, and now they had a future. They had food to see them through the coming winter. Governor Bradford invited Chief Massasoit and his people to join the celebration. Massasoit arrived with 90% of his men, nearly double the number of the surviving Pilgrims. The colonists were likely a bit surprised by the large number of guests, but the Wampanoag did not come empty-handed. Massasoit sent some of his men out, and they returned with 5 deer to contribute to the feast. And what a feast it was. This gathering, which we now call the first Thanksgiving, lasted for 3 full days. It was a true harvest festival. The tables were laden with the fruits of their combined labor and the richness of the land. We know from primary sources, like the writings of colonist Edward Winslow, that the menu included waterfowl like ducks and geese, wild turkeys, fish such as bass and cod, and of course the 5 deer brought by the Wampanoag. They also had the corn they had grown, which was likely served as a cornmeal pudding or bread, as well as pumpkins and other squashes. It was a celebration of abundance, a shared moment of peace and cooperation between 2 very different cultures. For 3 days, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag ate, played games, and demonstrated their skills. The English colonists fired their muskets in military drills, and the Wampanoag demonstrated their skill with the bow and arrow. It was a moment of cultural exchange, a brief period of mutual respect and friendship born from a shared reliance on the land. For the Pilgrims, it was a moment to thank God for their deliverance. For the Wampanoag, it was in keeping with their own traditions of celebrating a successful harvest. It is important to remember that this event was not called Thanksgiving by the people who participated in it. For the Pilgrims, a day of Thanksgiving was a more solemn, religious day of prayer and fasting. This was a harvest festival, a secular celebration of community and survival. The idea of Thanksgiving as a national holiday wouldn't come about for another 200 years. The story of the first Thanksgiving is a powerful one, but it is also just one chapter in a much longer, more complicated history between European settlers and Native Americans. The peace and friendship of 1621, sadly, did not last. As more colonists arrived, conflicts over land and resources grew, leading to decades of tension and war. But that does not diminish the significance of this one moment in time. The 1621 feast stands as a testament to the human capacity for cooperation and gratitude. It reminds us that even in times of great hardship, there is room for hope. It shows us that bridges can be built between different cultures, and that sharing a meal can be a powerful symbol of unity. It's a story about survival against the odds, about the kindness of strangers, and about the simple, profound act of giving thanks for the harvest. So, as we think about this story, let's remember all its parts. The hardship of the Pilgrims, the immense tragedy and generosity of Squanto, the diplomacy of Massasoit, and the shared joy of a successful harvest. It's a story of interdependence, a reminder that the Pilgrims' survival was not achieved alone, but through the knowledge and help of the land's original inhabitants. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to Plymouth in 1621. I hope this gave you a deeper appreciation for the story behind the holiday. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more stories from history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we've reached a significant milestone in our series, the final chapter on the Plymouth colony. It is time to step back from the specific dates and events and reflect on the enduring legacy of this small, yet monumental, settlement. What did Plymouth truly leave behind? How has its story, woven from threads of hardship, faith, and sheer will, shaped the narrative of America itself? Let's explore the profound and lasting impact of the Plymouth colony. When we think of Plymouth, the first word that often comes to mind is perseverance. Imagine that first brutal winter of 1620. Nearly half of the Mayflower's passengers perished. They faced starvation, disease, and the terrifying uncertainty of a world completely alien to them. It would have been so easy to give up, to despair, to let their dream die in the frozen ground. But they didn't. They held on. This wasn't just about survival. It was a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure unimaginable hardship. This story of pushing through, of rebuilding from the ashes of loss, became a foundational myth for the American identity. It's the idea that with enough grit and determination, any obstacle can be overcome. This spirit of resilience, first demonstrated on the shores of Cape Cod Bay, has echoed through every generation of Americans facing their own winters of challenge and adversity. Of course, you can't talk about Plymouth without talking about faith. The Pilgrims were separatists, driven by a powerful conviction that they needed to worship God in their own way, free from the structures of the Church of England. This wasn't a casual preference. It was the very core of their being. Their faith wasn't just a comfort. It was their compass, their constitution, and their reason for existence. It dictated their social order, their laws, and their daily interactions. The Mayflower Compact, a revolutionary document in its own right, was created in the name of God. This deep-seated belief that their community was a covenant with God and with each other established a powerful precedent. The idea of a society founded on shared moral and spiritual principles became a cornerstone of New England and, later, a significant thread in the broader American political and social fabric. It's the root of the concept of a city upon a hill, a community striving to be a beacon of virtue, an idea that has profoundly influenced American self-perception for centuries. But the legacy is more complex than just faith and grit. Plymouth represents the beginning of a new form of self-governance in America. The Mayflower Compact was a radical act. In an age of monarchs and divine right, a group of common people declared their intention to create their own civil body politic, to enact just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. This was a seed of democracy planted in the American soil. It established the principle of government by consent of the governed. While it was far from the inclusive democracy we know today, the town meetings that developed in Plymouth and other New England colonies became crucibles of civic participation. Here, free men could debate, vote, and have a direct say in the running of their communities. This tradition of local control and active citizenship is a direct political inheritance from Plymouth, shaping the American belief in grassroots democracy and the importance of individual voices in public life. Let's also consider the complex and often tragic relationship with the Native Americans, particularly the Wampanoag. The initial story we often hear is one of cooperation, personified by Tisquantum and the first Thanksgiving. And it's true, without the help of the Wampanoag, the colony would not have survived. Somerset's bold welcome and the subsequent alliance forged by Massasoit were critical. This early period of diplomacy and mutual aid is a vital part of the story. It represents a moment of possibility, a crossroads where two vastly different cultures met, and, for a time, found a way to coexist. It's a powerful symbol of intercultural cooperation. However, this is only one part of a much larger, and ultimately more painful, legacy. As more English settlers arrived and colonies expanded, this initial cooperation frayed and broke, leading to conflict, displacement, and immense suffering for native populations, culminating in devastating events like King Philip's War. The legacy of Plymouth, therefore, is also a stark reminder of the cultural clashes that define the European colonization of the Americas. It forces us to confront the full, complicated truth of our nation's origins, the moments of peace, and the devastating conflicts that followed. It's a dual legacy of connection and collision that we are still grappling with today. Beyond the political and social, Plymouth left a cultural legacy. It became a symbol. In the 19th century, as the United States was forging its national identity, the story of the Pilgrims was elevated. They came to represent courage, piety, and the humble, hard-working origins of the nation. The imagery of the Mayflower, Plymouth Rock, and the first Thanksgiving became powerful national symbols, taught to every schoolchild. They were seen as the quintessential American founders, not aristocrats or conquerors, but ordinary families seeking freedom and a better life. This narrative, while romanticized, helped to create a shared sense of history and purpose for a young and diverse country. It provided a touchstone, an origin story that, for better or worse, helped unify the nation around a set of core values: freedom, self-reliance, and providential destiny. So, as we close this chapter, we see that Plymouth is not just a historical event. It's a foundational story. It's a symbol of perseverance against all odds, a testament to the power of faith to build communities, and the birthplace of American self-government. It also holds the complex and painful story of cultural encounter, a reminder of the promises and perils of the New World. The legacy of Plymouth isn't a simple, clean narrative. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's profoundly human. It's a story of hope and tragedy, of innovation and intolerance, of survival and conquest. It's the small, rocky harbor from which so many currents of American history have flowed. Understanding Plymouth, in all its complexity, is essential to understanding the nation that grew from it. It's the first chapter in the story of New England, and a critical prologue to the story of the United States of America. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legacy of Plymouth Colony. It's been an incredible journey sharing these stories with you. If you've found this series meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the past. Your support means the world and helps us continue to bring history to life. We'll see you next time.